Good evening. I'm Nancy Kegan Smith, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of FLAIR as FLAIR's Vice President to tonight's FLAIR's program. Thank you to our partner, American University School of Public Affairs, and our FLAIR institutional members, Rider University, White House Historical Association, the Massachusetts Historical Association, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, the National First Ladies Library, and the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Our program tonight is First Ladies, Strength, Courage, and Support in Times of War, and will provide an excellent and fascinating look at the myriad of ways First Ladies have helped in times of war and how war has impacted their role. We are lucky to have as our chair, Katherine Sibley, who I call Katie because we've known each other for years, one of our FLAIR founding members and professor of history and director of American Studies at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. Katie is really just wonderful to have as the chair for this program because she is both a foreign policy scholar and a First Lady scholar, a perfect combination. Katie will introduce our very distinguished panelists, and we will take questions at the end of the program, which should be emailed to firstladies2021@gmail.com. More biographic information is available on each of our panelists on the FLAIR website. I also want to alert you to a very exciting upcoming event which FLAIR will have on Monday, August 22nd. It is the award ceremony for the 2022 Lewis L. Gould Award for Outstanding Work in the Field of First Ladies. Please watch this very special ceremony. To introduce the topic of First Ladies in War, I thought I would choose a quote about Eleanor Roosevelt from Admiral Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Fleet. The military didn't really want Eleanor Roosevelt to be the first lady in a war zone. And in August 17, 1943, she began a tour of Guadalcanal to visit our allies and to meet the soldiers and the sailors stationed on remote islands far away from home. And the military commanders put up all sorts of barricades, but Eleanor, in Eleanor's way, overcame them. And Admiral Halsey, after he had witnessed what Eleanor did for that month, she visited soldiers. By the way, she lost 30 pounds. She rarely slept. He said on her going, "When I saw her off, I told her that it was impossible for me to express my appreciation of what she had done and was doing for my men. I was ashamed of my original surliness. She alone had accomplished more good than any other person or any group of civilians who had passed through my area." Incredible praise from the head of the Pacific Fleet. I now turn the program over to Katie's very competent hands. Katie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you for your lovely introduction, most generous words. And it's really such a treat to be with everyone today. So I will now introduce our speakers. Again, these are brief relatively very brief introductions because there is much more on our website, as Nancy has noted about each of them. Barbara Perry, who is our first speaker, is the Gerald L. Baleals Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History Program. She's authored or edited 16 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, and civil rights. She will introduce our topic tonight with a contextualizing effort to put the first ladies in context in this whole topic of war. And it will really be a great way for us to embrace and understand this topic. Then we will go back to the 19th century with Professor Tom Balcerski, who is the visiting Billington Professor of U.S. History at Occidental College, as well as Associate Professor at Eastern Connecticut State University. He is the author of Bosom Friends, The Intimate World of James Buchanan and William Rufus King, and he will speak to us tonight on Dolley Madison and Mary Lincoln. And then we will have a more recent coverage provided by Anita McBride, who will conclude our program of presentations. And of course, there will be time after for lots of discussion and questions as people may wish to engage. And I hope you will take a chance to send in those questions. We have a link or a little note on the site so that you can do that. Anita McBride, our last speaker of American University, is executive in residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies in the School of Public Affairs at American University, where she leads the First Ladies Initiative and is published regularly on First Ladies. She will speak to us about Barbara Bush, Laura Bush, Michelle Obama, Jill Biden, and other recent First Ladies. So please now turn your attention to our wonderful speakers. And I do want to thank very much our technical backup, Rosie Kane and Diana Carlin. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Katie, for that very nice introduction. And I also want to thank our colleagues here this evening who have been so instrumental in the founding of FLAIR. I consider myself to be a First Lady Scholar newbie. And so I'm so inspired by all the work that has been done over the years in this field. And I also want to thank Anita McBride specifically for inspiring this topic for me by asking me to serve on a panel at the Presidential Site Summit that was held in Dallas this past March, because it was on First Ladies in just about the time that the Ukraine war began. And so I decided to do a piece for The Hill on First Ladies and war. And then Nancy picked up this topic and ran with it. And thanks to Diana for putting all this together for this evening. So if we can look at the first slide that takes not in an exhaustive fashion, but what came to mind as I look back through the history of First Ladies and wartime, I developed 8 ways in which they have, I think, contributed to the war effort. The first I call holding down the fort. The second, visiting troops. Third, bolstering military families. Fourthly, offering their own relatives sometimes to the cause. Fifthly, sacrificing on the home front during times of war, supporting our allies abroad, calming the nation at times of war and oftentimes immediately after attacks on the nation. And finally, sustaining the commander-in-chief. And so what I'd like to do now is take each of these in turn, if we can go to the next slide, and start to give some examples which will be elaborated upon by my very competent colleagues who are experts on these various First Ladies. But the concept of holding down the fort came to me from thinking about Dolley Madison in the War of 1812. As the British troops marched on Washington in 1814, and Tom can tell us whether this is apocryphal. I hope not. I like to think of this anecdote of Dolley Madison up in the upper floors of the White House with her spyglass looking for the troops. Her husband had already had to leave the White House and go out to be with the American troops, but she stayed on. And you can see from this drawing here that this is the famous story of how she helped to save the beautiful Gilbert Stuart portrait of our first president, George Washington. And by doing so, it now hangs happily in the East Room of the White House. But she also organized the staff and the enslaved laborers to help get that very large painting down and out safely, but also documents that were important to save for the American history and for American government. I think she was allowed to take those documents at that time. Visiting the troops. Mary Todd Lincoln, we know, and again, Tom will talk more at length about this, but visited troops in the hospitals, wounded troops from the Civil War, but also at the very beginning of the Civil War in 1861, Union troops were bivouacked in the East Room of the White House, as you can see in that little drawing up to the left. And I think that certainly she must have had some contact with them there. Anita will talk more about the first Mrs. Bush, Barbara Bush, and how she accompanied her husband, George H.W. Bush, the president, at the beginning of the what we call the first Gulf War, or Desert Shield, as it was called. And this was to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. He had invaded and overtaken Kuwait in the summer of 1990. And so with a coalition of the willing that President Bush and Secretary of State Baker put together, we had amassed, again, a coalition around the world, plus the U.S. leading. And here were these troops of the United States amassed in Saudi Arabia. And we know, looking back, that that war went very quickly. It was surgical. It was very successful. But we didn't know in 1990 that that would be the case. And so Mrs. Bush and President Bush went to Saudi Arabia and had Thanksgiving meal with our American troops stationed there at the time. So the next two that we talked about in the first set of 8, bolstering military families and even contributing their own relatives to the war effort. Bolstering military families, I think, has come very naturally for Dr. Jill Biden, our current First Lady, because she's a military family. That is that her son and the son of the president, Beau Biden, the late Beau Biden, served in the army in Iraq. So she knew what it was like to send a loved one off to a war zone. And when the Ukrainian war began with the invasion by the Russians of Ukraine this past winter, she made a stop at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as she swept through the country in March on her spring break from teaching at a community college in Northern Virginia. And she stopped on her way back from the Southwest. She had gone all the way out to Arizona, at which point every stop she would make and give a talk, she'd ask for a moment of silence for our troops who were already being deployed to Europe and Eastern Europe, and then stopped at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the home of the 101st Airborne, on her way back to speak to the families who had already had to say goodbye in such a quick fashion to their loved ones who had been deployed in Europe. And then to Eleanor Roosevelt, we could have a whole hour on Eleanor Roosevelt in World War II, but just imagine that 4 of her 5 children were male. All 4 of them signed on to fight in World War II. Elliot in the top left here was in the Army Air Corps. James, her eldest son, was in the Marine Corps. And the 2 younger sons, Franklin Jr. on the left and John on the right, were both in the Navy. All 4 sons served in combat zones and saw combat. So when she spoke to the nation and when she visited hospitals, she knew the odds were that of 4 sons, somebody might not even come back or might come back terribly injured. Thank goodness they were all spared, but many of them earned decorations for their bravery in combat. So now we'll go to the next category, sacrificing on the home front, and the next one of supporting our allies. Sacrificing on the home front, I decided to choose as an example Mrs. Woodrow Wilson. During World War I, she brought in sheep to shear not only the lawn, so they didn't have to use precious person power to do that, but they could also then shear the sheep and then send their wool to the Red Cross to be used to knit socks for our troops who were fighting abroad in trench warfare. That was particularly important article of clothing to have. She also would declare that there'd be certain days of the week where Americans were asked not to eat meat, as an example, in order to save food during a time of World War. Certainly, Anita McBride will talk more about the second Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, in 9/11 and the global war on terror that came after. But Mrs. Bush was noted for her support of the Afghan war. In 2008, she went to visit Afghanistan, a war zone. She met here. You can see the picture of her meeting with the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. And she also took a tremendous amount of time with women in Afghanistan, and forever after has been so supportive of women who remained in Afghanistan or those who came to this country. And I must say, one of my prize students at Sweetbriar College here in Virginia was an Afghan woman who came to do 4 years at the university, but she also would tell me, I met Laura Bush and how much that meant to her. And I'm happy to say that my student is now safe in Canada. Next slide, please. This will be the last one that I will show for this evening, and that is the concept of calming the nation and sustaining the commander-in-chief. Two prime examples of first ladies calming the nation after direct attacks on the United States. The first is, again, Eleanor Roosevelt is an example of this. On December 7th, 1941, she went on radio to give a speech to calm the people, to say, I know what it's like if you already have service people from your family. I must say my own father was mustered into the Army as a draftee the week before Pearl Harbor. And already Eleanor Roosevelt's sons were in the service. And so she said, I know what that must be like for all of you. I'm worried for my sons too. But she said, I know we'll get through this. We're a great country. We will get through this and we will win. We will get to victory. After December 7, 1941, which was not completely unexpected, a sneak attack, but not completely unexpected. One might argue that what was completely unexpected was the 9/11 attacks on New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington. And Laura Bush happened to be on the Hill to give a talk to a congressional committee that was being run in a bipartisan fashion by Senator Judd Gregg, a Republican, who's shown here on the left, Senator Ted Kennedy, a Democrat, on the right of the photo. And Mrs. Bush, who was in education, she had been a librarian in a public school. She was going to speak about No Child Left Behind and about literacy. And before she could even get to the committee room to start the process, the 9/11 attacks occurred. And so she was one of the first to go before the cameras to calm the nation, to say, be careful with the children, help them to understand what's happening. Because as you will recall, her husband, the president, was in Florida when the attack happened. He also happened to be in a school talking to two young students. And then he was unable to get back to Washington until late that night. And so it was especially important to have the First Lady come forward and calm us. And then finally, we haven't talked yet, and maybe won't a lot tonight, about the Cold War particularly. Mostly we're talking about hot wars, but Jacqueline Kennedy happened to be First Lady in the midst of the Cold War that almost heated up to the point of annihilating the planet. And that was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have precipitated a nuclear conflagration that literally would have ended the planet. She happened to be in Northern Virginia when the crisis began with her two children and the nanny. She would get away there, go to the horse country to get out of the fishbowl of the White House. And she says in her oral history, she got a call from her husband. And he didn't say why she should come back to the White House, but he said, please, if you could come back to the White House. And she said, you know, after you'd been married a while, you just know to listen to the tone of your husband's voice. And she knew something was wrong. So she came hurrying back with the children and the nanny. And she even met with two visitors from India and went out on the South Lawn to meet with them. You might notice, if you have a good eye for fashion, that she's wearing, even in black and white, the famous Chanel suit that was beautifully done in raspberry and that she would be wearing in Dallas the next year. But she said in her oral history that her husband encouraged her to leave, to take the children and go to a hidden spot that would get her out of Washington in harm's way. And she said in her oral history, I said to him, no, we're not leaving. I will stay here with you. And if I have to, I will die with you here at the White House. And so the president, in Thanksgiving to those people who helped him through those horrible 13 days in October of '62, you'll see here on the right, he had Tiffany's make up a calendar, a little paperweight with sterling silver with engraving the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he put on the right side at the top his initials, and then he put the initials of the advisor who helped him. I'm not here to say that Mrs. Kennedy was involved in the policy making that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis in a peaceful way, but she certainly was there to bolster her husband. So he gave her one of the paperweights with her initials on them as well. So with that, I'll turn things over to Tom, who will give us a lot more information about Dolley Madison and Mary Todd Lincoln.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak about two important First Ladies who in some ways are the epitome of the 19th century First Ladies at war. I've chosen to speak tonight about Dolley Madison as well as Mary Todd Lincoln. And I want to first begin by putting Dolley Madison in conversation with the First Lady whom we've already heard about tonight and whom we'll hear more about, and that is Eleanor Roosevelt. The writer and biographer, Jonathan Alter, called Eleanor Roosevelt the most significant First Lady since Dolley Madison. And that was in his book about the Franklin Roosevelt First 100 Days. I thought it was a very telling comparison that Alter made, and it's one that I happen to agree with, although I do think Mary Todd Lincoln is very much deserving of this significance, but I actually think Dolley Madison may well be the more significant of the two. I'll try to give the reason why, even as I'll spend time talking more about Mary Todd Lincoln. Because Dolley Madison and Mary Todd Lincoln in some ways are kind of opposites on certain aspects of their experience, but then actually they have quite a lot in common in terms of the structural elements of their biography that brought them into the position of First Lady, and also their experiences. Both suffered through major wars that threatened the integrity of the nation, and particularly Washington, D.C. and the White House. Both had to stand by and watch as destruction and death rained down on their capital city, and in some cases within their own family. So let's start with Dolley Madison here and talk a little bit about her wartime experience. She had direct wartime leadership, which is actually quite unusual for the First Ladies. And to my knowledge, she is still the only First Lady to command troops in war. Because when the British did attack on August 24th, 1814, there were 100 militiamen positioned on the White House South Lawn that Mrs. Madison, Dolley Madison, had direct control over. This in a kind of auxiliary unit to the more than 6,000 troops in Maryland who were attempting to interdict the British before they could make it to D.C., and they failed to do so. But that actually meant that Dolley Madison commanded troops by that estimate. Her managerial influence is also quite notable. And managerial influence in this instance is about the actual running of the White House, which in wartime means, in a way, running a military position of value. And indeed, her actions on August 24th, 1814 show her to have a sense of timing and poise that makes her famous to this day. And we can advance to the next slide. Because this very famous portrait, which gets some things right, as always, and maybe gets some things wrong in the process, and I know it's a little hard to see each figure, helps us to kind of see some of the structural elements that made Dolley Madison a significant First Lady and enabled her to be that way. The one I kind of want to point out is that the actual removal of the Gilbert Stuart portrait was done, we think, by an enslaved boy who was 15 years old named Paul Jennings. And the Jennings family were enslaved by the Madisons, and in various generations of the Jennings family became quite close in this service to the Madison family and were with them at the White House. And Paul Jennings published a memoir about his experience, ironically, during the Civil War, looking back on the War of 1812. And he is quoting Dolley Madison when he says, "Save that picture if possible. If not possible, destroy it. Under no circumstances allow it to fall into the hands of the British." He's quoting Madison in reflection. We also have Mrs. Madison's own words. We have a very kind of famous letter where she writes and stops and starts over a period of hours to her sister. And in this letter to her sister Lucy, she kind of describes as sort of like a running commentary, real time, what's happening in the White House. And she talks about the removal of the portrait. She talks about setting dinner, because you see that there was dinner set still for a party that she insisted on having, and then eventually her leaving, in the process saving important state papers. So it's all true. Something that I think I want to point out, and this gets to the political consequences of both Dolley Madison and Mary Todd Lincoln, is just how divided the politics of the nation were. And I think that's important to say, is that First Ladies can have a part in wartime of trying to bring together the two opposing parties. This time we're talking about the Federalist Party, who was generally against the war, and against the Madisons, who were part of this Democratic Republican political movement that had originated earlier under Thomas Jefferson. And so Dolley Madison did this. She tried to reconcile through, frankly, events at the White House, through her drawing rooms and soirees. When the White House burned during that attack on Washington, the Madisons eventually came back, lived in the Octagon House, which is another historic landmark right adjacent to Lafayette Park and very near to the White House today. And in the process, also stabilized the position of Washington, D.C. itself as a capital. So by her very example, by her endurance, by her holding down the fort, Dolley Madison stands out as a great wartime First Lady. So we'll move on. And Mary Todd Lincoln, I think, is going to not have to face the same challenges of a burned White House, that last image there. But of a White House besieged, of a White House and in a city that is made into the largest military encampment, really of the entire Civil War. If you count all the forts and all the soldiers in and around Washington, D.C., it was the largest military encampment of the entire war, and it remained that way for the entirety. It was so strategically important, of course. And indeed, despite it all, during her 4 years plus as First Lady, she will suffer loss and deprivation in her own family, losing one son while at the White House. That's her son, Willie, pictured to her right, as well as her husband, Abraham Lincoln, by assassination. Now, another thing I want to talk about, as we move on to the next slide, is just how the experience of wartime Washington played out at the White House. In this startling image from the early years of the war, we see soldiers sleeping in the East Room of the White House. And there's also images of soldiers bivouacked in the rotunda of the Capitol, images too that were reminiscent, not to images that we all saw only a year ago in January of 2021. So that those comparisons were sometimes made too about kind of what it's like to live in a city besieged. And by comparison, the Civil War, which lasted 4+ years, eventually figured out a way to house these soldiers and to bring the White House back to something of a normal life. And indeed, once Mary Todd Lincoln finally takes control of the social life at the White House, she too will use gatherings and parties and levees as a way to try to bring the different sides together. Now, it helps that generally speaking, the Republican Party of the Civil War era was the dominant party, at least for the first term, two years of Lincoln's term. Eventually, the Democrats will actually take control of the Congress on that second part of Lincoln's term, but she actually will continue regardless to make sure the White House is a place to have, at least on New Year's Day, gatherings and openings and receptions. So we can move on to the next slide. Now, Mary Todd Lincoln actually traveled a lot. She traveled so much so during her first 2 years, this is before the death of her son, Willie, which really changes her entire trajectory and throws her into a deep depression, that she was criticized in the press and also criticized for her spending. This is the case that she was given a budget in which to provide furnishings for the house and to improve it. And that budget she went through in the first few months. She also bought numerous dresses and was criticized for doing so because, again, it's wartime. And yet the First Lady wanted to uphold an image and wanted to, frankly, exert herself and to really revel in the fact that she and her husband were at the pinnacle of power. And this was just an image that I found of her visiting a life-saving station at the fashionable resort town of Long Branch, New Jersey, again, without her husband. And in all her traveling outside of Washington, never does President Lincoln accompany her. So on the one hand, we see a First Lady potentially making a politically unpopular move by continuing to travel and go to places that would put her in the spotlight. On the other, it also potentially was a way for her to keep herself in the spotlight. And that speaks a little bit to who Mary Todd Lincoln was. The next slide, please. Mary Todd Lincoln does pivot a little bit, especially as the experience of wartime sinks home. She will, during 1862 and 3, after Willie's death, visit hospitals and more than once a week in some cases during this period as a way to both deal with her grief and to help where she can to quietly actually provide aid and comfort to wounded soldiers, of which many thousands were situated right in Washington, D.C. It also gets to her evolution, I would say, in the issue of slavery. And I have Elizabeth Keckley pictured here, who was famous as her dressmaker, and she, of course, is African-American. And there was something of a friendship that developed between Mrs. Lincoln and Elizabeth Keckley that eventually plays out with both women after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, falling destitute, and both really suffering in the post-war years for various reasons. But I think it's important to show that Mary Todd Lincoln was very much in the moment, trying to kind of support her husband. And while I don't think she was an abolitionist going in, and I wouldn't say Abraham Lincoln was either, the experience of wartime Washington, her friendship with Elizabeth Keckley, I think changes her a little bit. I'll go to the last slide. Mary Todd Lincoln is one of our more controversial First Ladies, again, for the criticism that she received. Her question of her loyalty. I'm very much influenced by a wonderful book that came out some years ago about the Todd family. And 4 of her relations served in the Civil War and were killed. That is to say, her brothers, and she came from a large family of 14. Her sisters were split between pro-Confederate and pro-Union ideologies. And she actually really became estranged from most of her family as a result of the war, whether it be because they were on opposing sides of the war or over political reasons with even those who were on the Union side. So the Todd family, Mary Todd's family, was completely divided and quite frankly destroyed by the effects of the Civil War, as was, of course, the Lincolns. Her son, Robert, will also want to go and serve. She tries to keep him out of the front line of the fighting. And there's kind of a distancing that takes place over that. After Abraham Lincoln's death, it will be her own son, Robert Todd Lincoln, who has his mother institutionalized briefly. And Mary Todd will fight this and eventually obtain her own recognizance of freedom. But I think it goes to show that the experience of loss that Mary Todd Lincoln faced, the criticism she faced from the public, and ultimately the 4 years of hardship that she lived through was a reflection of the nation's own suffering. So if there's another thing I think that First Ladies can do, as we look at those various roles and as we think about some of the other more modern First Ladies, I guess I would sum it up by saying they can endure. They can take all that's given to them and hold their head as high as possible. And Mary Todd Lincoln, a very proud woman, did that to the very end. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Anita, and hopefully we'll be able to make some more connections later.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. And to each of my fellow panelists here and moderator, this is really a wonderful opportunity to shine a light on how our First Ladies and the connective thread really from Martha Washington to Jill Biden in support of the nation in time of war. This is in service to our nation. And I do really want to thank Barbara for the framework of 8 points that she presented at the very beginning of our discussion tonight. And several of those points is what I will expand upon now, one including visiting the troops, bolstering military families, supporting our allies, calming the nation, and sustaining the commander-in-chief. So the first slide of mine that I'd like to show you is, again, reflecting on what Barbara had said about Barbara Bush. And here she is, of course, eating Thanksgiving dinner with the troops in the Middle East. This is in Saudi Arabia, where our troops were stationed during Operation Desert Shield, prior to Operation Desert Storm, which of course was the launch of the war in January of 1991. One thing to, of course, remember about Barbara Bush, as she said to all these troops, you know, I'm everybody's grandmother. And she did really feel the need to wrap her arms around our soldiers, our men and women who were serving overseas, far from home, at a time of great peril and fright, really, in the world by this invasion of Iraq into the tiny nation of Kuwait. But she supported her husband. She went with him to Saudi Arabia. This slide shows her enjoying a lovely Thanksgiving dinner, sitting in the sand with her pearls and earrings. Our next slide, if you can move to that. What's really terrific about this too is here, these are with service women who are stationed and ready to fight in the war. And one of the things about Barbara Bush is she would tell the parents of our service men and women that she had seen their boy or she had seen their girl. She would write to them and provide an anecdote and a window into how they were faring while they were serving overseas, of course, knowing how frightened that they would be for their family. You would go to the next slide, please. One thing when we think of Barbara Bush, we think about her as everyone's grandmother, as the nation's grandmother, as reading to children, fostering the love of families to support each other, and through her literacy programs. She visited many bases around the country during this period of Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. Here she is visiting members of the National Guard in Arizona in February 1991, meeting with family members of personnel deployed in the Middle East and showing her support for them. And again, that example of bolstering military families, which Barbara Bush felt was very, very active in traveling around the nation to military bases. You'll see the next one as well, where she's in Indiana holding up the sign of a member of the military from that particular base that she had met. One of the things that, and I talked to a number of her staff members who worked with Barbara Bush during this period of time and traveled with her around the country. One of them told me a really interesting story of one of the base. She went to an arrival ceremony of Marines and who were arriving back home in California, who had been serving in Desert Storm. And she attended a rally for their return. And there were about 3,000 family members and guests that were at this rally. And she praised them for their service, showed support to these families, but also thanked the thousands of volunteers that lined the streets and lined the highways to welcome home these buses of Marines and sailors returning from their deployment. We can go to the next slide, please. Here, Barbara Bush's daughter-in-law, Laura Bush, comes into the White House, and you heard Barbara say on the day of 9/11, she is up in the Congress to do a congressional briefing to which she had been invited by the Senate Education Committee, a bipartisan committee, to report on a symposium that she had held earlier that summer on early childhood cognitive development. As a teacher, as a librarian, this was what Laura Bush intended to work on during her years as First Lady. It had been the priority and primary domestic agenda item of her husband's No Child Left Behind. This was the role that she was playing. Obviously, 9/11 what changed everything, changed not only the Bushes and the White House, but the country and the world. She had been, as you heard from Barbara, one of the first voices the nation heard, and to calm the nation. She was asked a question by a reporter who had been assembled there for her congressional briefing, which of course was postponed, but nevertheless, in a very impromptu briefing that she did with the two senators responding to reporters' questions, she was asked by a reporter from USA, what do we say to our families and our children? And her instinctive response was, tell them that they are safe and tell them that you love them and do not turn on the television. Basically, her first words to calm the nation, to give some guidance in this period of intense grief and shock that the nation was now facing, and of course had changed everything for our country. One of the things she did in the days following the 9/11 attacks is she made some visits to some schools, but also to the site of the flight. Now, if we can go back to that slide for a minute, Diana, the firefighters at a memorial service for the victims of Flight 93 in Pennsylvania. Over the years that the Bushes were in the White House, they became very close to the Flight 93 families. They did to all the families that they had met, but Mrs. Bush made repeated visits to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and actually was quite involved in the fundraising for that national park site. So here she is greeting firefighters and first responders who had been on site at Flight 93. The next picture, this is where, and Barbara also had mentioned about Mrs. Bush, I believe she had mentioned about delivering the radio address in November of 2001. This is about 3 weeks after the war in Afghanistan had been launched by President Bush. Mrs. Bush took to the airwaves. Here she is speaking from their home in Crawford, Texas. This is around the Thanksgiving time, and talking to the nation about delivering an address about the women in Afghanistan. It's really hard to believe now, given what we know Afghan women are facing now. this was a time when Laura Bush made the statement to try and have the country understand why we were in Afghanistan, what was happening to the women there. And frankly, her address, the response to it, surprised her. It surprised how American women had written to her at the White House, had seen her in when she was out, in fact, had been at a department store with her daughter not long after delivering this address, and how women had thanked her for telling them what was happening to the women in Afghanistan. And it created, as Mrs. Bush said, the sense of sisterhood around supporting women halfway across the world who had had this incredible brutality inflicted on them. So the radio address was something no one expected out of Laura Bush. And frankly, it was something that Laura Bush felt that she had found her voice in how she can support now this incredible and difficult effort in the war on terror, and what role she could play. And that was to help support Afghan women. We can go to the next slide, please. In fact, one of the things that Mrs. Bush had wanted to do was to visit Afghanistan. She had wanted to meet Afghan women that had been helped by some of the efforts of the coalition countries, not just the United States, but primarily the United States, in efforts to go back to school, to access healthcare, to be part of civic society in their country. And one of the things that she did when she went to Afghanistan in 2005 was meet women who had now been able to change the course of their lives at that time. But she also, of course, met with our troops, and our troops who were stationed in Kabul. She had dinner with them. She had a briefing from them on what they were seeing on the ground. This was all information, of course, she brought back to her husband when she went back to the White House, and to report to him. Again, another important role in supporting the commander-in-chief and being that the eyes and ears on the ground for him, many ways that Eleanor Roosevelt had done as well. If we can go to the next slide. Here, of course, one of the things that she did, one of the most difficult things, of course, any commander-in-chief would face, is seeing the wounds of war, of the people that they sent, a president knows that they are responsible for those visible wounds, the invisible wounds, the loss, the death, the grief that the country faces. And it's a very draining experience for any president to visit our wounded troops, but it's also very uplifting in thanking them for their service and recognizing really how profound this responsibility is to be the commander-in-chief. Laura Bush was often at George Bush's side on these visits to our military hospitals. And of course, the visits were difficult, and they were unfortunately frequent, but they were important for our soldiers and important for our the families of the military, to know that their president and their first lady cared about them. If you can go on to the next one, please. Here, Mrs. Bush is visiting with military families and children of the deployed who were based at Aviano Air Base in Italy. This happened to coincide during the time of the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, which were held in Turin, Italy, not far from our Aviano Air Base. Mrs. Bush traveled as the head of the Olympic delegation, but what she brought with her on that trip were 6 or 7 of former Olympians, American Olympians, and she brought them to this military base, knowing that this would boost the morale of our troops that were there and the families that were there. And it really was a moment that was uplifting in a terrible time. Remember now, of course, at this point, the United States was involved in 2 wars, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. You can go to the next slide, please. Here, Mrs. Bush is welcoming a delegation of Afghan women at the opening of our Afghan and the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan in Kabul, which of course now tragically is the headquarters of the terrorist network of the Taliban. But at this time, it was a period of great promise. It was now Mrs. Bush's second visit to Afghanistan. She made a total of 3 during her time as First Lady. And this was a period of time of now 4 or 5 years that the United States had been helping to rebuild the country. And there was enormous progress being made. These women that she are visiting are women who were elected officials. They were legislators, they were teachers, they were entrepreneurs. And clearly, as you can see, she sees this as a moment of great promise. And now, of course, 20 years later, we know that it's quite different. You can go to the next slide, please. Here, one of the things that we felt it was important to show in this presentation tonight as we talk about First Ladies and their strength and courage and support in the times of war is that thread of continuity and how this is something that is an extraordinarily bipartisan issue. By virtue of being the First Lady, they are spouse of the commander in chief. So they feel the weight of war. They feel the responsibility to support our military family, support our country, and support the president. And here, Laura Bush and Michelle Obama are speaking about this role, being spouse of the commander-in-chief, and the steps that they have taken to support our military families and the war effort. So this is a conference that was held at the National Archives in September of 2016, just right before Mrs. Obama was leaving the White House after her 8 years. This is one of the conferences that American University has hosted around the country on First Ladies. In fact, Katherine Sibley, our moderator, was a participant in this conference as well. And here the First Ladies are being interviewed by Bob Woodruff. Bob Woodruff, as you know, is an ABC news reporter who had been wounded quite seriously in Iraq. And he is interviewing them about their role in supporting our military and supporting the president in time of war. The next slide, please. So this brings me to the last 2 slides that I want to talk about, again, showing this thread of a continuity of support of all of First Ladies in wartime. And what's unique, of course, about Dr. Biden, as you see in this picture, this is, of course, she was serving as second lady. Mrs. Obama was first lady. Mrs. Obama's very successful initiative called Joining Forces, which really did help support military families all over the country. Dr. Biden is not only now spouse of the commander-in-chief, at this time, wife of the vice president, but she's also a military family. Her son had served, of course. Beau Biden had served in war and served in Iraq. So she has a unique and special connection to the military, to the families, very much the way Tom talked about Mrs. Lincoln. Here they are with Martha Stewart, no less, at one of the events that both Mrs. Obama and Dr. Biden would host around the country, showers for women, spouses of our deployed who were pregnant and were about to have their baby. And they're, of course, away from their spouses. And so I think it's an incredible role that these 2 women have played to support our military families. And here they're delivering blankets, pink and blue blankets, to babies who are soon to be born, along with Martha Stewart, who joined them on this event. The next slide, again, another Joining Forces event. They traveled around the country to a lot of our military bases. One of the aspects of this initiative of Joining Forces, which Dr. Biden has continued now, has relaunched as she has come back to the White House as First Lady. One of the things that was very important to First Lady Michelle Obama, in addition to, of course, supporting our military families, was making it easier for our military spouses to be employed at these different bases around the country that they were serving. There are different labor laws, different licensing laws for different specialties, whether you're a nurse or you're a teacher or whatever profession it might be, you move to a different state, there's a different licensing law. And what Michelle Obama, to her credit, worked very hard on was changing those rules and making it much more portable for our military families as they're moving from base to base and around the country to be employed. So I think if this gives you a sense, I hope, of course, as Tom had mentioned, the politics over war divides the nation. But the first ladies have been called on throughout our history to show the support, the courage in times of war, and strength in support of the commander-in-chief to calm the nation and help really to bolster our military families and bolster the war effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters tonight. This has just been a wealth of information, so stimulating, and so many really amazing slides that really underlined your points. So thank you for all of this. And I wanted to ask a question to Nancy, who started us out. Because one of the first ladies that you started with was Eleanor Roosevelt, and she's come up several times tonight. And I would like to ask you, Nancy, to tell us a bit more about her role in World War II, particularly the way it really pertained to civil rights. I think this is a really important issue, especially right now. And also, were there times, other times maybe in First Ladies' lives, and I'm thinking here of Lady Bird Johnson, but there are others like Laura Bush, perhaps, and I know we'll hear from others on these topics, when they became lightning rods for their husbands' policies, kind of bearing the brunt of the blame for some unpopular things. So let's start with Eleanor. And I believe we may have a slide about this as well. So Nancy, thank you so much for tackling this one for us.
Okay. The next slide, please. There are interesting impacts for Eleanor Roosevelt in World War II. A very positive impact was Eleanor Roosevelt's support of the Tuskegee Airmen, an African-American squadron. In 1949, she shows her support by visiting them in Tuskegee, Alabama, and she actually flies with one of the Tuskegee pilots, Charles Alfred Anderson, who was became quite famous pilot. But then a sort of negative influence is, of course, the Japanese internment camps. And in 1943, Eleanor, who was very against these, but was asked by FDR not to speak out, so she did not, visited Gila River in Arizona. And she wrote the most interesting article that was never published, which had the title, "To Undo a Mistake is Always Harder Than Not to Create One Originally." So that was CR's definite way of letting people know what she thought. Of course, the Vietnam War affected Mrs. Johnson in her environmental agenda, war on poverty. And Mrs. Johnson held a series 16 women doer luncheons throughout her administration to focus on women and what they had done. And in 1968, in January of 1968, she holds one on safe streets and crime, and invited Eartha Kitt, a African-American actress. Well, Eartha Kitt confronts President Johnson, who stopped by the luncheon, and then at the end of the luncheon gets up and basically says that African-American youth are being wrecked and dying because of the Vietnam War, are on pot, and that is facilitating crime. And the wife of the governor of New Jersey got up and refuted her, and then Mrs. Johnson did. And it's very interesting. And at the time, the press reported that Mrs. Johnson was in tears, but in her diary and the audio part of her diary that was recently released, she said, "I definitely was not in tears. But it showed, and then when I interviewed Mrs. Johnson later, years later, she said it, of course, was very wearing to hear the last couple of years, the chants, LBJ, how many boys have you killed today? And she also gave 2 very key speeches at Yale University and at Williams College in 1967, in which she was talking about the environment and how important it was to beautify it and make it better for the world. And she was picketed at those events. And so it just shows, these are just 3 examples. War can have a very positive effect. One more example I wanted to mention as we were all talking is that it's true for every first lady, whether it was Eleanor Roosevelt or Barbara Bush or any first lady who visited the troops. Pat Nixon visited the troops. They gave a special touch, a special humanity to the soldiers and the sailors that they visited. They would write home to their mothers. Eleanor Roosevelt always would write a letter, and it meant so much. And one of the quotes about Eleanor Roosevelt from one of MacArthur's aides, who was furious that she went to Guadalcanal, was when he saw her in action, how good she was. And he said he had never seen so many military officers and soldiers leave a room with a supposed cold after her visit. So I will stop there, Katie. Katie, I think you need to unmute.
I know we just have a minute or two. And Anita, I would love to hear from you. I know that you also had a quick example of another first lady who was a lightning rod, served as a lightning rod during her husband's wartime era. So please
Sure.
Jump in if you can.
Sure, I'll be very brief on this, but it is an example of that illustrates this point that you're making. One of Laura Bush's initiatives, of course, as we know, is on literacy, and she hosted a series of literary symposia throughout her 8 years on different topics in literature. And one of them that was scheduled for spring of 2003 was on poetry. And so the invitations went out to poets around the country. And what became very clear was that the event was going to be used as a protest. It was on the eve of the Iraq War. The invited guests had circulated amongst themselves what their plan would be in coming to the White House and protesting the war. The decision that was made by Mrs. Bush, and she said she completely respected their right to protest, but she was not going to invite that into the White House. This is intended to be a literary symposium on poetry, and so she postponed it. But it is somewhat akin to the example that Nancy just gave about Mrs. Johnson having invited women to the White House, and Eartha Kitt being of course one, and protesting the Vietnam War. I just think one other thing that I would mention very briefly too is over the division of the politics of war. In the 2004 Republican National Convention, when Laura Bush spoke at the podium and tried to pay, and again, this was the height of 2 wars now in the United States. It was a very close election, as we all remember, but she spoke in prime time to the nation, trying to paint this picture too of what it is like for a president to make the decision to go to war, and personally as a spouse, seeing the pain, the struggle, the grief, and watching it daily, and just trying to present the human side of this extraordinarily difficult decision that any president has to make.
Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that up. We have, I think, here heard so many really important and exciting aspects of how first ladies are affected by war, how they both have to struggle with it, how they both lend themselves to it, how they bring the country together over it. I want to thank all of our panelists. I wish we had more time for other questions, but we do have to wrap up. And thank you, everyone, for a most stimulating evening. And really looking forward to our next FLAIR panel, which will be on another fascinating topic. So please stay tuned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.